Jesus says in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John, "I have come that they might have life and have it in abundance." And that's a really enticing promise, right? This is what we all want, is a meaning, a life full of meaning, of purpose and happiness. This is what Jesus says he comes to offer, and this is what Christianity has sort of held out to people for the past two millennia. And yet, as a teacher in Catholic schools, high schools, and universities, Tony is absolutely right that I consider this a vocation. Increasingly, it's been my experience that my students do not seem to be realizing this sort of vision or promise for fullness of life. Very often, and again, Tony's comments quoting John Cavadini about the sort of a lack of understanding of even Catholic students, they're not finding this meaning and purpose within the Christian tradition. But perhaps even more alarming is that there are a lot of young people in particular who don't seem to be finding much meaning anywhere. I always think about one of my students who I taught at that certain school up north, who he was a really bright kid, very social, athletic, involved in a ton of clubs, came from a well-connected family. I just had a very, very bright and promising future. And yet it became clear to me, or rather I learned as the semester went on, that at some point he had slid into a rather serious depression. And as I talked with him about this, he explained that, in spite of all these good things going on, he really just at that point didn't see much meaning or purpose to his life. And sadly, this is not an isolated incident. A study that recently came out found that 1 in 4 young people, so people between the age of 13 and 24, 1 in 4 say that they rarely or never experience a sense of meaning or purpose in life. That's a quarter of our young people. Think of a quarter of our students here at the university. And I just find that terribly alarming. I think this has everything to do with the sort of rise in anxiety and the decline in mental health in our country, especially among young people today. And I think this is something that our popes have recognized. Pope Francis just last year said in a papal audience, "Today's serious threat is the loss of meaning in life." So this is what I really see is, even beyond this current health pandemic, I think there is this wider crisis of meaning affecting our society. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand, what's happening here, what is going on with our students. One person who's been really helpful to me is Robert Kegan, who is a psychologist emeritus up at Harvard University, another one of those universities up north. And he makes an argument that life in the modern world makes more mental demands upon us than most of us are equipped to handle. The title of one of his books is "In Over Our Heads." And so he talks about things like, if you think about the way that people have to navigate their relationships, a career, but also sort of putting together, constructing a sense of identity in a way that people didn't have to do in the past. Plus living in an era marked by radical pluralism, where we're constantly encountering people from different perspectives, cultures, religious backgrounds, and worldviews that challenge our own. And then on top of this, we live in this time where we're just flooded, bombarded with information and images and messages through our smartphones and computers. And all this happening in a society that's marked by a very rapid rate of change. So Keegan's point is that this is a lot for any of us to juggle as we're trying to make sense of the world that we live in, as we're trying to make sense of ourselves and our lives. And modern people are perhaps particularly poorly equipped to deal with this, because at the same time we've seen a sort of disintegration of the frameworks of meaning that gave meaning to people's lives really up until very recent history. The sociologist Peter Berger talks about religion as historically really the main source of meaning for people's lives. It's something that could virtually be taken for granted in just about any civilization, any era in history up to the present. But in recent history, we've seen a sort of secularization, and I think Charles Taylor's work on this is really helpful in understanding secularization is not just a decline in religion, but he talks about a sort of supernova effect. That there has been a weakening or a fragmentation of a Christian imaginary or worldview, but at the same time, all these alternatives have come in. People have you can be Christian or Jewish or a humanist or an agnostic. But the effect this has is that almost never is meaning a given anymore. We see all of these alternatives presented to us in terms of understanding the world and life. So there's no default. There's no given. And all of these positions are fragilized, Taylor would say. As I think about this as a Christian educator, I do think that the church is somewhat at fault or somewhat remiss in the midst of all this, in the sense that the church has not always adapted adequately to the changing times. We have not, and I think John Cavadini is one pointing to the need to adapt, but we have not always done this quickly enough, recognizing the struggles that people are encountering and adjusting the way that we hand on the faith so that people are equipped with this. I think one of those oversights is a failure to recognize and treat people as meaning makers, as beings who have to construct a meaning for their lives. So where all this leads for me is I've come to land on this, what I see as a primary task for education in this current era, and that is supporting people in developing habits of meaning making that they need to live full lives, to lead faithful lives in the postmodern world. And so that's sort of the setup. That's the challenge that I try to respond to in this book. Okay, so if those are the challenges that we are confronted with, then this raises the question, well, what kind of meaning making would be adequate to the postmodern world? If, as Keegan says, we're all in over our heads, what would help us to get our heads above water? So I go into a lot more detail in the book, but I'll give sort of 3 examples of what this kind of meaning making might look like. And relate these to some features of society as we experience it today. So one important feature of modern culture is that it's a very critical culture. So we are living with the legacy of the Enlightenment, which of course brought critiques of religion, but also sort of an elevation of human reason. Not taking anything dogmatically, but rather trying to be able to justify everything, to find reasons for it. We live in a time that's marked by widespread positivism, an attitude that if it can't be seen, tested, quantified, then it is not real. It's also an era in which we see widespread suspicion of institutions and authorities. The polls have been tracking this in recent decades, and we've seen a steady decline in people's confidence in all sorts of religious institutions, or rather institutions in general, but including religious institutions and churches. So living in this critical culture, although there have been gains from this, it also has a negative effect that it has really emptied the meaning out of a lot of our traditions, a lot of those traditional sources of meaning that people used to draw upon. So where does that leave us today? Well, today, in order to make sense of the world that we live in, we need what I would call a sort of post-critical recovery of things like symbol, ritual, story, embodied and contemplative modes of knowing. So these are all traditional sources of meaning that have sort of come under fire, that have been critiqued by Enlightenment thinkers, by scientifically minded people who are wary of superstition, of things that can't be quantified, that aren't empirical. But what people are realizing in the current era is that that kind of critique, it's helpful in some ways, but it doesn't give much meaning to life. And that is embodied in imaginative human beings, we really need these sources of meaning. And so the answer is not to go back to a sort of a naive era in which we just dwell in superstition, but to inhabit what Paul Ricoeur would call a second naivete. So bringing those sort of gifts and strengths of critical consciousness to these elements of religion, like symbol and ritual, not falling into that superstition, being aware of those dangers, but also recognizing our need for these things and the meaning that they can give to life. So this would be one feature of a kind of meaning making that we need today. Another feature of the society we live in today that I've already alluded to is this sort of breakdown in a Christian worldview, which is concurrent with a breakdown in community in our society. So the result of this, as I was saying before, is we really can't take much as a given anymore. We don't just inherit meaning, or we don't inherit our identity in the way that people did in previous eras. At the same time, we just have many fewer supports and structures to support us than we did in the past. So Peter Savastano spoke earlier in this series about his book on Thomas Merton. Merton, in his very last paper that he ever gave, offered this famous line that from now on, everyone stands on their own 2 feet. And I think that's very apt in thinking about where we are today. That there are just so many fewer supports in terms of the religious support. The community is not there to just carry us along anymore. Everyone must stand on their own 2 feet. And what I mean by this in terms of meaning making is that we live in a time when people, first of all, have to be self-aware of themselves as meaning makers, to recognize that meaning is not something that is simply given, that can't be just assumed, but it's really something that we must construct. And at the same time, I would say that going beyond that, we need to be not only self-aware, but we need to exercise what some researchers and educators would refer to as self-authorship, to sort of intentionally take up this work of constructing meaning for our lives. For the Lonerganians in the crowd, Tony, plug your ears. I don't want to give you any more of a headache. This is, the sort of thing that Lonergan is thinking about when he's talking about self-appropriation, recognizing how we know, how we make meaning, and really taking on that work in a very deliberate fashion. So a third and final feature of society that we live in today, again, is the sort of rapidly changing context and this information overload that we all suffer from in an era of smartphones and the internet. So living in a time when we are constantly bombarded by so much information, where so much is changing, it's simply not enough to hand on a static body of doctrine or beliefs to people, because those set of beliefs, that worldview, is going to be challenged on virtually a daily basis in the world today. So what we need, even on top of that, is we need to be able to be active imaginers. We need to have an active imagination. In other words, we need to be involved in this ongoing work of creating a worldview, constructing a worldview, and sort of recreating that and refashioning that as it is challenged by the world that we live in. So to give an image, we could think about, not so much when we hand on a tradition or hand on the faith, not sort of building a house for people to live in, but rather training the builders. Training them to be building that home for themselves, and to continue work on it when the storms of postmodernity do some damage. So these are just sort of 3 features of the kind of meaning making that I think would be more adequate to the world that we live in today. And I tend to sum this all up with this phrase of a post-critical meaning making, or a post-critical faith. So it brings those skills or gifts of critical consciousness, but recognizing this deep human need for meaning and for the things that give meaning, like symbol.